Nice being here. Thank you. Okay, Deborah, you can introduce us.
Okay. Well, Stephen Poplin, what can I say? He's a transpersonal astrologer and a spiritual hypnotherapist, has degrees in philosophy and humanities, and has taught these subjects in several colleges. I'm sorry, I have to do that. And Germany, a globetrotter, and he is all over the place. Living part-time in Europe, he was just in Spain, and the United States. Stephen is also an interfaith minister with workshop leader. He has studied history, drama therapy, symbology, numerology, and metaphysics, among other interests. He has been president of 2 NCGR chapters in the USA and has taught many topics in astrology over the years. He travels frequently, giving talks and leading seminars. Stephen is the author of the 2-volume series on reincarnation, inner journeys, and cosmic sojourns. He is known for his compassion, insight, and humor. Here we have Stephen, and thank you for the presentation this evening. I know it's going to be wonderful. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Asheville Friends of Astrology, for this invitation. And these are really quite the times. We'll be taking a look at, of course, since we're in the eye of the storm over here in the United States of America, a lot of astrologers over the years have been looking at different astrology charts. So I'll be taking a look at that scope of the USA, and we're going to be taking a look at quite a few different methods and types of charts and theories about what is all of this about. There are many charts and theories, not only about the United States chart, but natal charts for nations worldwide. And one can take a historical perspective, also theoretical, astrological, symbolic, looking at the signs and symbols and so forth, recognizing that there are quite a few different options out there. And I start off with even the whole concept of the magic of charts and bringing things up to perspective on when does a life begin. And that is true for a human, an animal, a nation. And this really a great image here of that water drop. And then there is the soul, let's say, falling from the sky, coming into the earth, the physical manifestation. But then there are people like Edgar Cayce who talked about there is a difference sometimes between the physical birth and then the soul birth. And then it can be the timing of the delivery of a child, let's say, and then the first breath, which could be a minute or two later. So yeah, it's a bit of a, look and see and try different things and see what happens and then compare. And then, of course, the bottom line is that it has to work. And that brings up yet another perspective. You all might have seen this image before, actually probably in black and white. That's when I first saw it, probably in the 80s. And it was doing the rounds. It was, people showing that. And it was called at the time a wood block from the medieval period. And one can imagine that that makes total sense because, that person looks like he or she is dressed in a medieval manner. But then it was like some years later that they said, wait a minute, we have identified it, and it's the Flammarion engraving from 1888. And so that's yet another way of looking at charts, what is attributed to it is folklore, and then what's the truth. So we've got a racetrack full of hopefuls, all kinds of astrologers betting their horses, having their favorites. And interestingly enough, and this is true if you take a look at tarot cards, symbology, numerology, I Ching, and so forth. You can use all sorts of things to get valid results. And, but is that the mathematics of the horoscope?
Okay.
So some of those charts in the running, and they make a good case for it, some people. The first permanent settlement in America, that was in St. Augustine, Florida, that goes back to 1565. When is the birth again? But again, that wasn't, the birth of the United States. That was a Spanish colony. Then we have the Pilgrim's Landing there. That was 1620. And how about when things really started to heat up over here in the colonies when they had the Boston Tea Party? And another chart was calculated for that. I note that Campion, their British astrologer, has got a wonderful set of charts all calculated, and that's just one of them. One can choose other options too, times of the Revolutionary War and various other things. And then we have the Sibley chart. And I'm sure you have all come across the Sibley chart. It's the one with the Sagittarius rising. And I must admit, when I have heard over the years, over the decades, people giving their announcements and predictions about the USA and what's going on, usually they'll pull up the Sibley chart. And I've always wondered, why is it so popular? Because again, I checked it out years ago and it just didn't cut the mustard. And I'm wondering, could it be part of the American myth, with that nice, positive Sagittarius rising? And wouldn't that be great? But the background on that was Ebenezer Sibley was a Freemason astrologer in England. And like 11 years later, he came up with this chart. And he used kind of a couple of different methods hodgepodged together. As you can see right here, it was set for 10:10 p.m. London time. And they used London as the capital of the colonies because that was true. When they declared it, there was no capital of the United States because it wasn't independent at that point. So he compared different things, different times, and the planets are set for a local mean time, and it was generally criticized as rather confused. Then there was the opposite option from the Sagittarius rising. Then we had the Gemini rising chart, and that was from an astrologer during the Civil War who thought that, okay, well, here we have Aquarius, and in the United States is an Aquarian country, and it was in Gemini. And so therefore it must have Gemini rising. And when he calculated that, it was set for 2:15 a.m. Okay, come on. Those guys were not in session. So I went about, I lived in the Washington, D.C. area for several years, and then took some trips up to Boston, Massachusetts, and I went to the Houghton Library there in Harvard and came across then the Charles Thomson Papers. And these are the minutes of the Second Continental Congress. And here is just a quote right there. Journals of Congress ordered that the Declaration be authenticated and printed. That is, the words we're looking for. And so I copied several of the pages from those notes, and I'll have them here. And it's not like, let's read through them, but this, of course, is being recorded. And so at your own leisure, at some point, feel free to read these several pages. But I bring them out here just to like a blow by blow, a minute by minute excitement of what they were doing. And here on the left, we see that John Adams wrote that July 2nd, this day will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I believe that it will be celebrated as the great anniversary. And because on July 2nd, and it describes that here in the notes, that yeah, they came up with the wording, and but it wasn't quite perfect. It was pretty much, and in the declaration here, and that's what happened on the 2nd. So that was yet another option, another time to take a look at it. Here we have again the notes from the journals of Congress, and here we have then the 3rd of July and what happened there, and nothing happened on the 3rd of July connected to the Declaration of Independence. That's what happened on the 4th of July, and that shows up over here. You can see on the bottom left that every day was adjourned to 9 o'clock tomorrow. And so they all started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and not sure exactly when they stopped or ended their meetings. It was probably not the exact time every day, depending upon their workload. But here it is right there at the beginning. They had one item that they worked on there on the bottom left, and then they get right to it. Here is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. So that was like option number 2 on the day. So it was in the morning that they really got to it. And here for your reading pleasure is the whole declaration in the original notes. And so they go through, of course, the famous wording, and it continues here more about the burgeoning United States of America, a brand new idea, that new concept. And then they said, okay, that's it. John Hancock, he writes his name at the top. And then it was not signed by all of these people on that day. Some of them was like a week later, some 2 weeks later, a month later. I think there was like yet the last one was maybe in November 1776. So you can't go by the last autograph either. But this, the 4th of July, and this is a Cancer country. Would a Cancer country remember their birthday? I would say yes. And then still on the 4th, after they in the morning, they fix up this document, and then they send it out for like the final wording. They probably made a couple of changes, in this morning session. Then it goes out, they're going to print it, and it comes back during the day sometime, on the 4th of July. And then they get onto some other items. And I wanted to point out these other items that they had to get to. And you can see again here on the right-hand side, the list of that. It goes on to the next day, a list of different things. And if you really pay attention to it, they had a lot to do that day after they dealt with the Declaration. And that to me is like saying they didn't have, they didn't get into a possible chart option later in the day, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, because they were so busy doing everything else. And besides, the original work was done in the morning. In fact, they talked about in the 11th hour is when they had finished that declaration and the wording of the declaration. And so this is, again, Campion used a 10:30 time. And this is what I consider to be the bones of the United States. This is when they had agreed, yes, this is the declaration. Yes, we're going to separate from Great Britain. And but then it was still in committee, as it were. They sent the document off to be fixed. However, this chart I find interesting. It's not the birth chart, but it is kind of like, remember that drop of water going over here. There's something about this which is why I call it the bones. It's going to show us a couple of interesting things. And the biggest thing, can you see my cursor here going around the top up here, and the Gemini midheaven, and here's Mars, also 21 degrees. And the country was at war. at that point, and also already for a year. And I'm thinking if you take a look at the progressions, it had Mars has already been like a year ago was aspected, and now it moves forward. But this key chart here has got the Mars squaring Neptune in Virgo. And I think that that really says a lot about the United States. Here we have, Mars and at the top, and of course, everyone knows that this country is the biggest military power in the world and has been for many, many decades. So it would make sense that Mars might be way up there. But here we have the Gemini uh, perspective, which is the two, which is divided, and the country would be divided. And we're going to be paying attention to this Uranus position here, also in Gemini, and what happens when it has its Uranian return, Uranus coming back there. But the Mars square Neptune, and Neptune in Virgo, I immediately think of that as the enslaved. But also as a religious country. This is a very religious country. There are like thousands of denominations. There's, churches everywhere, all kinds of communities. And I, who have lived many years in Europe, that's not the case there. That has kind of died out over there. But religion is very much a part of this land. But it's also this Neptune in the 12th house of institutions, and one of the institutions was the institution of slavery. And unfortunately, that was built right into the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, they did their compromises, as it were, and the southern states said, "Well, we will keep our slaves." And of course, that's going to have some repercussions a little bit later. The other thing about this is this Mercury, and Mercury, by the way, rules the midheaven of this chart in Gemini. Mercury's over here in Cancer. Exactly opposite is Pluto. And so here we have the wonderful documents of the 11th house, the Declaration. Then they had the Constitution. So we're going to be seeing that, Mercury making great statements, important documents right there. But then the opposite of there is connected to Pluto power, but also this is a revolutionary statement. I mean, they are saying we separate from Great Britain, and so it starts a war. I continued to do my researches and came across that name, of course, John Hancock. And he was very significant there. He's the first one that put his name on that document. And so there's a couple of books that I came across, biographies of John Hancock. This particular one on these pages is from Patriot in Purple by Herbert Allen. And that was originally printed in 1948, and this particular copy is from 1953. And there on this page to the left, at last, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 4th, the Great White Paper was reported out of committee to the House with a recommendation for approval. And so it's like, well, how about that? We've got actually finally a bona fide date. Then I came across another book, and also about John Hancock, and this is called Merchant King and American Patriot by Harlow Giles Unger. And that was published in the year 2000. And again, here we have it that this fellow also wrote down. It was 2 in the afternoon, July 4th, 1776. So to me, it's like, okay, we're now getting some bona fide information. And then about that same time, I came across this research astrologer called Mark Penfield. And he also came across this information before I did, and came with a 2:20 p.m. time that he said was based on John Hancock's recollections. And that came to be an 8 Scorpio rising. And I was using that for about a decade or so, and then came 9/11. And there was a slight issue with that, but it was only a 1 minute adjustment, which is a pretty minor thing. But that's why my chart is just 1 minute away from the Mark Penfield
Hmm.
version. And that's the chart that you see right here. This is the horoscope that I use that came out after the morning chart, where we showed the bones of the United States, which is some of the issues of the United States. And now how here we have the Scorpio rising chart. Now, here as Scorpio rising, the ruler of Scorpio is Pluto. Pluto is down here in Capricorn in the third. And that one could say is a hard working planetary position in the third house of writing, information, also documents, education, also the transportation. And of course, this country was, whether that be the automobile, whether that be the railroad, yes, transportation, again, going across this huge country. And there is the powerhouse, Pluto, there in Capricorn. And by the way, that is definitely a business-oriented placement too, Pluto in Capricorn. Now that can be emphasized over here by the Venus is up here in Cancer in the eighth house. That's connected to other people's money and income and finances. Mars up there also in the eighth house. The planet Uranus also in the eighth house. But also the eighth house is kind of like what is not visible? What is stirring behind the curtains? And that we'll see very soon that that led to the Civil War, which divided the country in two, and then we'll be seeing this Gemini thing again. In the meantime, here is a positive Sun in Cancer, in Jupiter, also in Cancer. Here's Mercury up here, ninth house, a big, strong ninth house. And that has that Sagittarius flavor that I think many people are looking at when they pay attention to the Sibley chart. But it's also one of those things that the Sun is the ruler of Leo, and here the midheaven connected to the parents. Now, in an individual chart, I believe that the midheaven, the MC, is going to represent the same sex parent. The opposite down here I see is the opposite sex parent, and then looking for the rulers of those two particular points. But this particular one up here with 15 Leo, which by the way is back to the United States as pretty much, the big boy on the block. It took a while, but it is definitely a powerhouse and has been a powerhouse for a long time. But if we take a look at that position just as like, the parental energy, then this Sun over here in the ninth house in a water sign, this was the British Empire. And here is the Sun next to Jupiter. It was the biggest empire in the world that made the Independence War a bit more of a difficult thing because this was a powerhouse. And again, international and maritime over there. But we also again have the Declaration of Independence. I told you, here's that Mercury up there in the ninth house of documents, courts, Supreme Court, great judgments, philosophies, all of that is there. And of course, the great documents and the Constitution is all represented up there in that ninth house. And in Mercury, then, which is, by the way, retrograde. And so there were some issues, there were some problems with the initial ideals. One of them was the representation that only pretty much the elite should be voting, and that was the Electoral College that has been certainly a problem ever since then. But then also that, they built in that there would be, slaves, that was a compromise. It is then opposing Pluto down there again back into the third house. And there's been all kinds of ideas, information, pamphlets, And here lately, in the last many years, these big Fox News and other organizations spouting, their version of history. But that's, Pluto, Mercury up there. So go figure. Now, a couple of other interesting things here. The third house is classically, again, your neighbors. It could be if you live here in the fourth house, and this is your home itself, then the neighborhood is over here in the third. And for a country, what was the neighborhood but the Americas? And very early in American history, they had the Monroe Doctrine. And that was basically telling the Europeans, keep out of our area. This belongs to us. But then, not that long afterwards, it turned into the manifest destiny. This whole area, manifestly belongs to us. And then, they took over Texas, went off towards California, and but it was their destiny. And this is again part of the PR stuff here. Ninth house ideas, and then the Pluto there. But also when you take a look at some notions, here again is the Neptune thing in the 11th house. Give us your tired, give us your poor. I mean, very idealistic right there. But at the same time, it was still that Neptune in Virgo squaring Mars over here, now a bit hidden in the 8th house. And so by force, we will keep those slaves. So it's really great ideals, but what's really happening? Then here we've got the moon, and oftentimes in mundane or political astrology, the moon represents the people. And here's the Aquarius. It's an Aquarius. It's right next to the very clever Pallas Athena, 1 degree away. And this is an inventive people, hardworking, bright, curious, and yeah, that is definitely part of the American ingenuity and can-do perspective, always kind of tinkering, making things better, from innovations in automobiles and then aeroplanes, and then all the way to technology and now AI. I mean, we're always very inventive. By the way, as we go along, just feel free to ask some questions. Just feel free to say whatever. I jump over here to one of the really first dynamics that's going to shed some light on if indeed that was the correct time, that 219 time and the Scorpio rising. Does that fit? It has to work in history. And here we have the time of the Battle of Fort Sumter and several many months prior to that, since Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the southern states were seceding. They were leaving. They said, no, no, because this guy, part of the Republican Party, by the way, wanted to, stop the slavery thing. And they had been fighting about that for years, but it finally came to a head because they said, oh, well, then we have to leave. And that was the split. That was the Gemini split. And we have 84 years after 1776, which is a Uranus return. Uranus came back to where it was, at the inception. And transiting Mars, also in Gemini, right there, squeezing the natal Uranus between Mars and Uranus, transiting return. And yeah, that is definitely a war sign and a split right there. But what's also quite interesting is, remember that with Scorpio rising, Pluto is the ruler of the chart. It is transiting 8 degrees Taurus. It is right there on the 7th house cusp. And this is when, this day was when the Civil War started. The other interesting thing here is here we have this Neptune, and it's the very, very tail end of Pisces, And the next day, the 13th of April, it left Pisces and it goes into Aries, which is what it just did recently, about a month ago. So, like, wow, how interesting that is. And a powerful placement there, too. If you just take a look at the Fort Sumter attack chart, the rising sign is right here, ascendant, and that means Neptune was rising and Mercury was rising. And I've already talked about how those two, the high ideals, as well as the documents and the declarations and so forth, that was also on trial, as it were, in Pisces, which is the opposite sign of where Neptune was at the beginning. And I talked about that as slavery, but also religion and hardworking Americans. And here, all of this is opposite right there. A little bit less than 2 years later, we had the a very big thing that Abraham Lincoln initiated, the Emancipation Proclamation. And this triple chart tells a lot of the story here. The middle chart here is the U.S. chart with the 8 degrees Scorpio rising, the natal. The second circle here is the secondary planets, and secondary progressions is basically a concept of 1 day equals 1 year. And that kind of follows, for instance, the sun, and this just as an example, it is 1 degree per year with the sun, moving very regularly. And so it was here at the beginning in Cancer, and here by 1863, that progressed sun just moved that far in that many years. So a couple of interesting things. By the way, the third line is actually just, the day of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that was set on the 1st of January of 1863. So more of a transit chart, but here it's a significant chart, for all time because it was so major and it was an important part of winning the war because suddenly, the blacks, the slaves in mostly the South weren't just waiting to be liberated; they were declared liberated. And then many of them started to join the troops, the Union troops, and that helped win the war. The progressed midheaven, and right, that's found over here. It's at 15 degrees. It is squaring the MC up here. And a square is a change in power dynamics. And it was a strategy on Abraham Lincoln's part to do that. Here is the progressed Mars, 17 degrees, and here again, that's 15. So Mars had been, right up there at the very top, representing the war that had been going on for several years by now. The progressed Mercury and the moon, I find this very interesting because the moon in a secondary progression moves about 1 degree per month. And here it is 29 Aries 52. It's the very, very end of Aries. And big things are about to shift when something like that happens. And it's exactly opposite Mercury, progressed Mercury here at 29 Libra in the 11th house of the scales, Libra, in the institution of slavery, that the moon comes up in Aries. It says, we will, by force, by proclamation, we're in the middle of a war, we're going to say, you are freed. Let my people go, as it were. Very powerful. The progressed ascendant shows up down here at 22 degrees, and that 22 will show up a couple of different times. Mars, for instance, is 21. So there is a quincunx to Mars. And again, we're talking about something is off. They do not agree with this. And so there's some tensions with that. The other 22 is back up here to Neptune, and it's a lovely trine to the Neptune. And that was the promise that should have been, let's say, taken care of at the beginning, but they swept it under the rug at the time in 1776. And one Uranus transit later, then they had to open up those pages again. Then also something quite interesting. Here is Jupiter. Excuse me, Jupiter progressed. It is. Oh, here it is. It's 22, and there's that 22 degrees again. And it is, you can see it didn't move very far, but the outer planets in the secondary sometimes don't move at all. But Jupiter did to the 22 degrees, making a lovely sextile to this Neptune. And again, emphasizing their freedom, the promise, the ideals. And so that was the promise fulfilled by the Bones chart. And as far as the transits go, we've got this Neptune placement, and we've been watching Neptune from the very beginning. And how it fits into it. It's transiting over here in Aries at 1 degree Aries. Now, we already know at this point that the 0 degrees and the 1 degree Aries is probably a sensitive point, not only for the world, but definitely for the United States. And here is Neptune. Remember that when the war started, at Fort Sumter, Neptune went into 0 degrees Aries, which is where it's at right now. So this position here, at 1 heading towards 2 is going to be making a square to Venus up here in the house of other people's property. And, the slaves were considered property at that point. But the Venus rules Libra, and Libra is over here where Saturn is and representing the sign of the scales and law, and put it into the court changes. Any questions about that? The 4th of July, using that as the chart and recognizing that when we go to the very beginnings here, 1781 was when the planet Uranus was discovered. And I believe that that is the beginning of the Aquarian age. And right there in the middle, 1781, okay, then moving towards 1776, the American Revolution, the other side of Uranus being discovered, the French Revolution, and then we had, of course, the Industrial Revolution all during that time. All of those things are, to me, quite clearly Aquarian sorts of dynamics. But in that year, 1776, Adam Smith published Wealth of Nations. And this is the book, the early book on modern capitalism. Same year. And I feel that that has kind of followed as a concept, as a ideal America ever since. Here was, in that same year, 1776, James Watt patented his perfected steam engine. And again, technological innovations, what's next? What's the next thing? That's also very much a part of this nation. And I told you about that 1 minute difference from Mark Penfield's chart. This is where I get it. And that brings us up to 9/11. And here is a chart that probably many astrologers have looked at from time and time again. But having the Penfield chart here in the middle, maybe you haven't really looked at it that way. But the outer circle, again, are the transits, and that was, that very day, the New York trade bombing right there, and where everything happened to be at that point. The secondary, again, is here in the middle. And so that is a very powerful chart. And a couple of interesting things about that. Here we have the progressed moon. And here again is the progression. And the moon is up here, and it is at 28, and it is remember that progressed moon moves about 1 degree per month. And so here it is in the 7th house of others, of external connections, of what's happening on the outside, who are we talking to, negotiations, diplomacy, and things like that. And here at that point, it's making a very nice trine from Earth sign to Earth sign. And we can take a look at the progressed Pluto, or in the natal Pluto, it's still a trine. And this is like general international goodwill for America that had been attacked. And it just shows really positive aspects here of a lot of support coming to the United States, sympathy from other nations. The Gemini thing, the nations attacked in the attack itself. The ruler here, this is, by the way, ascendant. And as we all know, the ascendant is like tick tock, tick tock. It's just moving very quickly. But in that attack, Mercury was rising. It was exactly rising 14 degrees when that happened. And of course, Mercury classically rules Gemini, and it was the twin towers, the ruler of Gemini. Then we take a look down here back to the progressions, and here is the sun at 26 degrees, and the US moon, as we've seen before, is 25 degrees. So that was about a year before there was a Cancer president born, George W. Bush. Here's the moon in the fourth house, and there he was as the president. It's really interesting. The other thing here was that this alignment that I just talked about with the Mercury rising at 14 degrees, it was pretty much exactly on the natal Saturn in Libra, in the hidden house of enemies. Classically, the 12th house is the hidden enemies right there. And it is something about Saturn. And so Saturn classically works with government decisions. And I'm thinking that, we're probably talking about blowback, something about US foreign policy pissing off Muslim lands. Well, we can probably come up with a couple of different ideas for that. Then we have the transit here of the nodes. And here, right there, we have the nodes, and they are here having just crossed Venus that September. And again, we're back to Venus associated with, this Cancer country, and with business and so forth. Here, it just shows that not that long ago, and I think my recollection was something like a month maybe after the attack, George Bush went up to New York City, and he officially said, New York City is open for business. And I just thought, okay, I thought we were going to mourn a little bit more. But again, the business of America is business, back to the wealth of nations. Any questions about that? Here is a close-up of the secondary. And this is where I get that 1 minute difference, from that 2:20 time that Mark Pinfield here. Here is the progressed midheaven at 0 degrees 0 on September 11th. And I tell you what, the midheaven moves about 1 degree per year. Okay, so yeah, it was coming up on that in latter Pisces, and then right here on the day, it goes into that Aries, and here's that sensitive 0 degrees Aries point again. But that is, almost like a reset, because that, Aries is the beginning of the zodiac. So it was a reset for Aries associated sorts of things like homeland security. Airports will never be the same. All kinds of also, beefing up securities of things, and the beginnings of two foreign wars coming from 9/11, and that's of course Afghanistan and Iraq, that we were involved with for 20 years, all the time that from 0 degrees Aries until 20 degrees Aries, 1 degree per year, that it finally left when it got into the Sagittarius decanate. And then they said, okay, well, I guess we're finished with this. But that's where I made that slight change of 1 degrees, which is not why it's not 220, it's 219. The 219 time gives us that exact progression when it went into 0 degrees Aries. And some things that's now happening a little bit closer to the now. And by the way, did the image just change? Okay. The the
Hey, Steven,
yes,
can we ask a question now?
yes. Oh, sure, anytime.
This is fascinating. I was just curious, and if you haven't done it, I'd be curious to see if you're interested in doing the future. But just recently, Trump was over in the Middle East and like released the sanctions on Syria, and met with the Saudis, and it was the Saudi prince that was responsible for the 9/11 attack. I was just wondering, like, what the like on that day around that time, like what the hell was happening then? Because it's just turned upside. The guy in Syria used to be Al Qaeda, and now
Exactly.
he's the
It's
president. It's just like, what the hell? Anyhow,
what
and then giving him a plane. What was the plane that went in the World Trade Center? I was just curious if you'd done that or.
Oh, definitely. In fact, you anticipate me. That's what's coming up next. I've got here now the U.S. Secondary progressions to the inauguration of Trump, and a very telling chart. And by the way, you can still see my cursor, right? Did this bottom part disappear? Can you still see Pluto down here?
No, we can't.
You can't? Okay. Yeah, I get kind of a vague shift in the visuals, but indeed, the progressed Pluto is at 29. It's 27 in the natal chart, 29 right here. And that's the only thing, well, missing. We've got Mercury over here at 23 in Aquarius. But secondary chart, here is the beginning of Donald Trump. And look at where the progressed moon is. 0 degrees Aries. And from day one, he was on the warpath. And that energy is there. Again, the moon moving about 1 degree per month. And he's been there for 4 months now. So that's how fast that moon is moving. But how interesting that there it was when he began, and it's that famous 0 degrees Aries. And so again, we're on the warpath, and he is basically fighting all of the woke people, and that also shows up here with this opposition of Mercury is higher education up here in the ninth. And opposite here, Pluto, because we have had something very unique, very interesting, because the country is now 250 years old, and it takes that long for Pluto to go around the zodiac. So what we've been experiencing here from the first Trump presidency was the Pluto return. And that has been talked about quite a bit. But again, Pluto went all the way around the chart and it has been back here in Capricorn again for the last 8 years at least. And so the Pluto return now adds a more of a darker dynamic. Partly, I believe that we're talking about collective karma of this land, and not only connected with what happened with the slaves, with the blacks, and also with indentured servants, but also with the Native Americans, and and then if we go beyond that into international interference in other countries and the CIA getting involved with other people, other countries, coups and so forth. Well, that's what also happened in Iran, when they wanted to have a free election in 1952, 1953, they got rid of the Shah and they wanted to change the business dynamics, nationalizing the oil industry. And so the CIA helped stage a coup there, which then turned into 1979 and the Ayatollah Khomeini and so forth. So basically, there's a lot of stories connected to that. But doesn't that make sense with Pluto in Capricorn in the third house? What are those stories? What is going on? And they're not telling us. There's a lot of backroom deals. Now, the other interesting thing about Pluto is that it is a plutocracy. And it came in, big guns. I mean, that was true, with the first Trump presidency. But now, I mean, he had a bunch of billionaires sitting next to him in a plutocracy. And a plutocracy basically means being ruled by the wealthy. And so, again, that's part of the national karma. But the other part of the national karma is, again, all of those terrible things and broken treaties, Mercury, Pluto, broken treaties with the Native Americans, the things offered various people, but now they're taking the back. And that's happening again with Trump, all the different promises, that is even looking at Social Security and Medicaid and so forth, taking it back, breaking the treaties again. So all in all, I think in general, the Pluto return is about national karma and collectively looking at our sins, looking at even one could go towards like reincarnation, and one can hypothetically say, I wonder if a bunch of Confederates in the last 30, 40 years have, returned, born again into this land, and they're at it and they want to have a different outcome than what happened in 1865. The other thing about this Pluto in the third house of education, of lower education, elementary schools and so forth, shootings in the classroom, it's like children for years, for decades, have not been safe in the classrooms. And I think that's also part of the karma. When I think of that and just imagine here we have, let's say, a Native Americans in their village, and then comes the cavalry, right? And they just, there's lots of historical records about this, and they just shoot everybody. Well, is that part of the collective karma coming back? And so innocent Native Americans and now innocent children from out of the blue just being killed. Lots of stuff connected to that. So bottom line is that, we've got a plutocracy in charge right now. And that, by the way, was true with the election last November. Pluto was still at the very tail end of Capricorn. So even though it took like 2 weeks later that Pluto left and now it's in Aquarius, but during the election, it was still in Capricorn. And so I think it's, there was one extra last phase of this Plutonian karma. What showed up also during this inauguration, and I don't have it here because I've got the secondary, but on the transits, it's on the 20th, of course, of January, by law, and the sun was, in Aquarius, sun was conjunct Pluto, at this very same time in Aquarius. So, yep, Pluto, and he's a plutocrat with his other plutocrats and the super wealthy, and some of the drama, some of the crazy drama here of, again, that moon in Aries squaring Venus, theatrics, and even, getting, now think of Venus up here and all the people that he's getting from Fox News, these, several women and people who, perhaps look good on TV, and they're now part of the cabinet. It's just crazy times. The midheaven over here, it shows up here at 24 degrees in Aries again, and it's making a square to the Mercury. And that is also part of the presidency so far. That again, this is the Supreme Court. These are the higher judges. This is law, and this is the Constitution right up there in the ninth house, a square. And of course, Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, and Mr. Gemini is at the helm. Then we have, luckily, we've got the Venus here, right over here at 5 degrees, and it's making a very nice aspect, a sextile up to Jupiter. And I'm saying, oh, good. Well, thanks for that. There's a couple other difficult points, but popular, uprisings, pushback, and the higher mind. And when you think of Venus, Jupiter, ninth house, it looks pretty woke to me. But they're standing up. The progressed ascendant is over up here at the top, and it's at 6 degrees, and it's right on top of the natal nodes here. And so again, back to this karma, many times, people look at nodes as, what did you do in a past life and where are you going with it now? So that's part of it. Another is international recognition. Where do you stand in the esteem of nations? And we are on trial at this point. There's some people, kind of more forgiving, or maybe even some of those so-called enemy things that you had just mentioned with Qatar and Syria and even Saudi Arabia. And now there are good friends. And so a shift of allegiances, I think, is looking at it this way in the ninth house. And then we have to say, can there be liberty for all? Because it is a positive aspect ultimately, but sometimes it has to be shown up as we could go this way or we could go that way. We're at that point. The door is open. Then we have here Saturn in the progression at 2 degrees, and it's making a lovely trine up here to Venus. And I mentioned before, Venus ruling Libra, the scales and law. And we're talking about, okay, the judges coming in and saying, no, we have to stop this. Judicial reform, wake up or lose out. But then back to this progressed Mercury here, Mercury down here at 23 degrees Aquarius, moving up towards a conjunction here with the moon, and then the people, maybe more like next year, we'll be having more of a voice. But right now, 23, it's making a quincunx to its natal position here. And again, it's like something is off. It does not compute. You say this, you do that. What's really going on? What's the truth? Fake news? What about the law? It's just, part of that confusion here again with the Mercury, and again, the president, a mercurial person. And I mentioned, of course, the Pluto return that has been happening for a while, and I found this very funny, interesting. The Arizona state senator here, when Pluto was really, exactly on this natal position, and that was in 2022. But it's all this whole period of time, the Pluto return still happening right now. And so she was, of course, one of those conspirators, Republicans, and but again, here's the religious thing here too. Freedom of speech is a human right granted by God. Companies and governments who go against this are going against rights that make up the essence of humanity. Really great speech here. And then, of course, you got such a pushback from all of that. Then she was soon saying, or telling off people, on the social media, the nasty, vile, satanic demons who post wicked pictures and videos on my channel have a special place in hell for their evil. Get behind me, Satan. So here we are, 2025, moving towards 2026, and I have got this chart set for next spring. And that is when we have the Neptune-Saturn conjunction. And I just did, 2 weeks ago, I did a talk on that. But very powerful whenever those two get together internationally, there are some big changes, earthquakes, typhoons of a political nature, and lots of things, upheaval. And here they are, again, the US chart in the middle, and then the transit charts when they have the actual conjunction here, and that's next February 2026. So this is in the near future. But here we have again that famous 0 degrees Aries. It shows up again. This chart then, is a classic transit chart, but it is a significant conjunction chart, and then we pay attention symbolically to what might this represent for the rest of this year, 2025, and going on into 2026. We already know that, 0 degrees has always been a very powerful point and position for the United States, and tensions are rising right now. And the interesting thing I find about here, and this might even be something that if the Democrats and the woke folk can use, it's in the 5th house of children. And that might be the Achilles heel. If I think more children are affected, and we already know that they're talking about Medicaid school lunches, poverty, punishing children, as well as the whole thing about birthright, abortions and things. All of that is very 5th house. All of those are major issues, and they have been for several years. It's also kind of a Pluto thing too, life and death. But 5th house, and that might be some smart things about, okay, yeah, are you really pro-children? Well, they seem to be suffering in the present administration. What are we going to do about that? So that's just one dynamic connected to that. In this here, here is the Venus up here, and we've talked about this before. It is a capitalist country, of course, and the Venus during that conjunction is at 12 degrees Pisces, which makes a nice trine up here to the sun in the 9th house. And that is walking the higher walk. These are greater ideals. What are we really about? And are we a country to be admired or not? I think it also could represent that there's other nations that will inspire us, and sometimes even by that recent election in Canada, where they could have elected more of a conservative, but then because of Trump, they elected more of a liberal because they said collectively, no, we don't want to go down that same road that you, our neighbors, are going down. So that may be a part of this really nice aspect right there. In the meantime, this moon is again at 12, and the 12 degrees is squaring that sun. And even though it's a quick transit, it's again pointing towards, we had the trine, that's really nice, but now we have the square, and that's not so nice, but it's still the same issues. What about higher law? What about justice and the Declaration and the rights and the amendments and things like that? So it's being duked out, but it's also an omen. What is the USA ideal? And what about our international reputation? This Jupiter up here, 15 degrees, and it is making a square over here to Saturn. Jupiter, you can see, is retrograde, and so it's already made that aspect, and probably twice by this point. So again, we're back to Saturn of the law, of committees, of legislation, of justice right here. And it's a square. Some people doing the right thing, other people doing the wrong thing, and they're checking each other out, and we're at a stall and things don't seem to be moving, but they are moving. But of course, it's also the attack on woke and the attack on education. I had mentioned before, this Mars at 22. Here's that famous 22 degrees again, and that makes a quincunx, a difficult aspect here to Neptune. And again, back to the slavery question, and are they wanting to, bring in the handmaid's tale, and have women in that secondary role? And what about, minorities? I mean, they're being identified. It's a quincunx with Mars. Mars is aggressive about that. But that same Mars position has been making a nice trine up to its natal position here. And that has another dynamic connected to, there are the guys in the white hats, and then there's guys with the pointed hats. The two Geminis and the two sides, and echoes of the Civil War. The midheaven, which shows up down here, 24 degrees, at that very moment when Saturn and Neptune align, the quickly moving midheaven is at 24 degrees, right on top of the U.S. moon. And of course, that's the people. And the people have got to get involved. They can't be so passive. As we all know, the majority of voters did not vote. And that's been true for my whole life. I mean, they just don't vote. And so we have these, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. We've got the two-party system that we can't seem to break out of. So maybe when the people wake up and say, it is participatory. We do need to do something. And this moon, of course, rules the ninth house of higher ideals, Cancer. Then maybe this is going to wake up the populace so that they're just not always dealing with, their fourth house stuff, my home, my rent, my condo, my automobile, my food, and then have a larger ninth house perspective of we are all in this together. And if we don't vote, if we don't participate, or if we make some wrong choices, we will also suffer, even though we're trying to mind our own business. The sun here at 2 degrees, water sign Pisces, making a very nice aspect up here to Venus at 2 degrees, and that's good. And I'm thinking that one can still have a good stock market, good business expansion and so forth, but maybe more of an ethical dynamic because Venus is ruling Libra. But we still have to deal and watch out for the plutocrats and the cryptocrats. I had mentioned before the nodes. Here is this node here at 8 degrees, almost 9 degrees, and that is squaring the planet Uranus over here. And Uranus, again, every 84 years, the U.S. has been in war. I mentioned the Civil War when it came back, but we were in World War II when Uranus was in Gemini last time. Well, here we see that Uranus is going to be touching upon the next sign of Gemini, very soon. And so it will be inching, up a little bit closer again to another Uranus return. And I hope that we're not in another war at that point, but the last 2 times that has been true. Any questions about this?
You got it. Wow.
Stephen,
Yeah.
I've been watching for a while, and I think we are essentially at war, but an evolution of war, where it's, I mean, the news was horrible tonight, looking at the people starving in Palestine, and especially the children.
Right.
So the consequences as far as death and destruction goes, if you look at Ukraine and stuff like that, and the US's involvement in both of those, and how we're participating and complicit in it, I would make the case that it's not where we're in foxholes like World War I, or standing in fields like the Civil War and charging at each other, but I see it as an evolution of that's pretty much having the same destruction and tragedy and crisis. So
Yes, yes, I would agree. And even when I was looking back at the 9/11 chart and then the times, and then, some people were saying like, well, it came from out of the blue. Well, no, it didn't come from out of the blue. It was, again, the U.S. policies connected with Israel and the Middle East. And so it's actually an old story. That, if either the U.S. policy doesn't change their ways or Israel doesn't change their ways, then of course you're going to, go back and do what you did before. And if you had a war before, you're going to have another war if you don't change your policies. I think one of the interesting things here, and I don't know why the U.S. is kind of like karmically associated with Israel, but if you take a look at the Israeli policy with the Palestinians, it's pretty much mirrors the American policy with the Native Americans.
Mm.
I was just going to say my uncle worked in the World Trade Center when the first bombing happened. A lot of people don't know about the first bombing that happened. He worked for a reinsurance company, and they moved across the river after that. So there was shots across the bow before.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that. Yeah. So you are the revolution. And here's this piece by William Faulkner, the novelist. Never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion against injustice and lying and greed. If people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth. And I think that's the higher ideals that even the United States has periodically strove for, wrote in some of their documents and speeches, and are better natures, as they say. And then I thank the various other astrology researchers here and give thanks to them.
Nice.
And that's the big picture here. And I hope I was being efficient with it. There was a lot of material here, but thanks for paying attention to all of that. And I hope I didn't overwhelm you with a lot of minutiae with the aspects and placements and so forth. But, as astrologers, all of that is quite interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. It really, to me, it tells the story.
It was fabulous. And I'm like you, Stephen. I love my research. And I have to tell you, this was absolutely spectacular in my eyes. And I've been doing this 30 years. Not quite as long as you, but
Thank you after that.
I think you did a fantastic job. And also you taught me Zoom a week and a half ago and all that. And you showed me how the cursor would work and how you can do different presentations. And you're just a fabulous colleague, and you're trying to pull all us astrologers in with you. Give us this information, because mundane astrology with you and your background is indeed a magnificent gift. And I thank you for having this tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And thank you all for coming. And yeah, it's good to share these perspectives. And I can, if you wish, we got a little bit of time, we can take a look at some of the charts I already had, or we can just, talk shop and what may happen or not happen.
Oh, sure.
Hey, Ronnie, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Hi, Stephen. Sorry I'm so late. I was just typing that message. I couldn't get my computer to cooperate. So I'll have to catch it on the recording. But
That's right. That's the nice thing. It's all recorded. And
Sure,
again, so, where's that? The other interesting thing that I found with some of this research, you saw that, the Puritans, that could be a time, to set up a chart, when they came here. But the Puritans were basically fanatics in England, and a lot of them were kicked out. And that they didn't tell me that in the civics class.
yeah, it seems like our world has become a massive chessboard.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Which is players being moved around from country to country. It's quite pathetic. and there's a lot of evil ones out there, but it's just, we can go back to and where did all this start even before then, the Continental Congress, and before then, in Atlantis and all that. So how do you break that thread? That's the point.
That is
Yeah.
really it, when sometimes we just have to get our nose bloodied, and then we say, oh my goodness, boy, I won't do that again. And some of you know that I lived in Germany for several years, and they collectively have a national guilt. And in their education system, in their public television programs, since the end of World War II, they are telling the German people, this is what your parents and your grandparents did. Never again. Nie wieder Krieg. That's it, And today, I find that the German people are one of the most open people in the world. And if you travel almost anywhere in the world, you're going to come across Germans. And they're kind of like looking, internationally for ideals, I think, from other cultures, from other nations, because what they grew up with is that they cannot be too proud of their recent history.
Because Germany's an Aries country, is it not?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you always have generational astrology, and the outer planets that signify the next wave coming in with a different level of consciousness. That'd be an interesting topic sometime.
Indeed, yeah. When they had the East and West Germany, I did both of their charts, and their moons, and the moon moves very quickly, in any particular day, about 12 degrees per day. And they were on separate, maybe years that they were at least many, many months between the East and West nations being founded. And their moons were within 2 degrees of each other in Aries.
Wow. Really?
And of course, they were the Aryans.
Right. The Aryan nation.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
So very interesting. Interestingly enough, though, that since the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. There was a united Germany, and the new chart for Germany does not have Aries. They have gone beyond that. For instance, in Israel, Netanyahu, I think he's a war criminal according to The Hague, international law. I think also Putin is, and that must be embarrassing for a lot of the people that your president, your leader is recognized as a war criminal. I hope that we don't go down that path. I've said even from the first Trump years that luckily he's not a military man
yet.
Yeah, he's more of a businessman.
Yeah,
we don't know if he's a very clever businessman, but he's definitely interested in money and acquisition.
Well, yeah, to the extreme where he's eliminated a lot of the generals in the military. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, our so-called enemies out there are also observing the U.S., and we really are a weakened country since Trump.
I think that Trump has probably crossed the line when he deported those people down to that Venezuelan torture prison. I hope that there's justice for that.
I do too. Yes. Yes. Yeah, because that's such a reflection, a similar sort of thing that's what the Nazis did, and they didn't have their concentration camps in Germany. They had it in Poland and other countries. They exported those prisoners to keep them out of the view of the citizens.
The only thing good about that is it brought the world's eye to see what they were doing in Venezuela. And I think the president down there is getting a little bit nervous, and he should be. It's disgusting. Nobody drink there. No, not Venezuela. I'm sorry, El Salvador. Don't drink
El Salvador.
Salvadorian coffee. Boycott them.
Yeah, right. As well as the Ninth House expansion that periodically the U.S. would expand it, and we do have military bases around the world. I don't remember how many countries, but we are an empire. But if you ask the average American, is the United States an empire? No, it's like we're actually quite a very giving and generous country, and those people in foreign lands are taking advantage of us. But I think that's back to the Pluto in the third house of propaganda. Us also collectively as Americans to make better decisions of when we vote, when we get involved, when we make our calls or telegrams or postcards over to our elected officials, and we're still kind of like waiting. A lot of us are still waiting for the Democrats to wake up. But the Republicans for quite a few years. And AOC, by the way, has pointed this out. She said that they oftentimes laugh at the established Democrats because they know what they're going to do. They are not going to surprise you. They're going to play by the rules, and the Republicans are not. And so they get their nose smacked many times because they're trying to pretend that this is a nation of laws, and meanwhile we've got this Pluto return where someone says, "Well, I think we're going to take over this nation of laws and come up with a new batch." So unfortunately, that's also what we're looking at, and that 0 degrees Aries showing up several times is really pointing towards when things get hot quickly. And here recently, Neptune has gone into Aries, and this month of May, at the end of May, Saturn will go into Aries too. And so it's going to amp up a little bit more by the end of this month, which is going to set us up for the 14th of June, which I understand there's going to be mass protests, at least, which is going to be Trump's birthday. And he's trying to have this military parade in his honor. Oh my goodness.
So there's
It's
going
just
to be mass,
crazy.
it's going to be mass peaceful protests. I feel pretty confident.
Oh yeah. And that's the ideal. And that showed up a couple of those aspects I pointed towards, like the trines to Venus in Cancer, and positive aspects to Saturn in Libra, as a strategy, classically going back to Gandhi and Martin Luther King, to have peaceful protests. But we know that the Proud Boys don't give a shit about that.
Well, that's why people are staying away from DC. So I'm curious if you've ever done these charts looking at these patterns with, before there was Gandhi, before there was Martin Luther King, there was the women suffragists. Especially there was like a parade in like 2013 where they got they remained peaceful, but which they needed to, because there was this crowd of men and police officers and people were throwing bottles at them. They experienced violence, but they did not become violent. Have you ever done anything with those charts, like in those key times?
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. In fact, again, that recent talk that I gave about the Saturn Neptune, not only the conjunctions, but their oppositions and so forth. And I found a pattern that shows up is feminists and very brave women step up to the plate during those alignments. And I'm seeing some women, step up right now already. But in the past, even people like Sarah Bernhardt, I think, and Florence Nightingale, and of the temperance movement in the 1870s, 1872, very important, significant women, aligned with the, when you think about it, the Neptune is the higher vibration of Venus. And Saturn comes there and says, let's get into the system. Let's have power and have a say-so. But for all women, and of course, they were also, besides women themselves, women's issues, but also for the poor, the people who were left out, the slaves, the people who were in sorrow, one could say, and again, the vibration of Neptune. So yeah, that shows up quite a few different times, and I expect it to happen right now because again, we've got the Saturn Neptune thing. And by the way, again, I talked about it, when the last time that they got together was in 1989, and that was when they had the singing revolution up in the Baltic countries in Estonia. And then they had the 600-kilometer long peaceful hand-in-hand protest between those Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and just hand in hand, making that statement, we are united and we will no longer be a part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, those photos were beautiful. I remember those.
Yeah, very inspiring.
Stephen, do you?
Also, there's been at some of these times some really great music, inspiring music and words and lyrics that unite people together. I'm not aware of anything happening right now, but I expect it soon.
Do you suspect Neptune rules immigration and immigrants?
We'll definitely, back to, bring us your poor, bring us your starving, masses, classic Neptune, and that shows up again in the 11th house in the United States chart. And that is, minorities, groups, ethnic groups, as well as whether they came forcibly or not, because again, we're talking about that Neptune square Mars, and Mars says, well, you're coming if you like it or not. And the other ones are saying, well, we're leaving because things are really quite difficult back home. Yeah. In fact, when Neptune was discovered in 1846, that same Saturn was conjunct Neptune in Aquarius. And that was during the potato famine in Ireland. And so Neptune is again invisible solutions and blights and difficulties of an invisible nature, but they had to leave Ireland, and so there was a big influx of Irish coming to the United States, and they, as a minority, they were really looked down upon. I'm not sure if you knew that, but there was even signs. They in the Old West they said no niggers, no Irish. And they were really, like these unkempt people who just drink and fight. They had a really bad reputation, and they had to deal with that in the 1840s and 1850s.
I was just thinking about the pattern as far as like St. Patrick's Day, like everybody's Irish on St. Patrick's Day. And I was saying to, I don't know, this was like, a couple of decades ago, I was talking to some of my Latina friends, and I was like, there will come a day where Cinco de Mayo is going to be like St. Patrick's Day. There's just some like weird hazing our country does for ethnicities where we're just nasty to them, and they like hang out and they're so cool, and we learn their culture and we're like, where are you now too? Even though we're not.
Right. Yeah. And Cinco de Mayo for the Mexicans, that was, them fighting off the French invasion.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, a lot of people even don't know that history, but they like, what is it, margaritas and tacos.
Exactly. Wearing the sombrero and, having some tacos.
Stephen, I have excuse me, one more question about Neptune. So the first thing one thinks about, one of the things with immigration is movement. And Neptune is a water planet. So I guess you could consider that sort of movement more like a tidal wave or the power of water, which is very impactful, as we've seen with hurricanes and all kinds of other things. It doesn't quite solve it for me. Do you have any added points for that?
Yeah, especially when we take a look at the Neptune as the care and the compassion for the down and out, for those who have less, for those who are suffering. And then Saturn comes in and says, well, we have to do something about it. And in some nations, they have their, revolutions of independence, and things are in flux at that point, and then people escape. And then there's these waves, back to the Neptunian waves of immigrants, refugees, and so forth, going to other nations, other cultures, and some of them are welcome, and some of them are not.
So it seems like you're adding in aspects from other planets to really initiate the movement part of Neptune.
Exactly, right.
stasis until it's activated.
Exactly. And then
Okay.
we're talking about, like how can some of the other planets motivate immigration and actually, leaving, the country of your birth. For instance, if it were, Pluto, then it could be like the mafia or the cartels,
Mhm.
that, make people afraid, and then they escape, they leave. Also during, Pluto was discovered in 1930. And that was, the fascist rise at that point. And many individuals, people were escaping the fascist um, wave of Pluto.
So one of the qualities of Neptune is amorphous and dissolution. So it really so when you consider there's no boundaries in a sense, then it's very malleable. And that's where the mind control comes in, especially aspecting other planets and maybe returns and so on. Oh, thank you. I've solved that.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyway, thank you.
yeah, yeah. And sometimes, that's the wishful thinking of Neptune, quite idealistic, and, tomorrow's going to be a better day. But we go back to the manifest destiny, and where there was, again, this belief system that this land is my land, this land is not your land, from California to the New York Island. So there was this feeling that, yes, the destiny of the white people, of the Protestant whites, was to take this land, from coast to coast. And that was truly a real big belief system, during the 1840s, 50s, 60s. There was also this a small group of people, militants from the South, coming with their own kind of cavalries and aggressive groups and troops, and they wanted to go and take over lands in Mexico, Central America, and in the Caribbean as new states, but they would be slave states. And then there would be, an expansion of the South. But those lands had been freed of slavery since 1821. So they were not going to go back. And so they didn't, they just like whooped their tails when they came down there. Just prior to the Civil War, they were sending off these militias, to expand the United States and have these, southern, Central American countries, be a part of the United States, but as slave states. And that did not go over very well.
So Neptune is slavery also, right?
Pardon? Oh, yeah, yeah. When you think about it, and that shows up here, quite early with the Neptune in Virgo, with the U.S. chart squaring the Mars, in Gemini, that, they are forced into slavery. They will work. Virgo work. Neptune is the down and outs, and, the people who don't have their rights or their strength, but Mars will make sure that they will fall into line. And unfortunately, that's also part of the American history, and it shows up in the chart.
Was there anything activated during that time in the 1840s and 50s that incited this supposed takeover of other lands or the attempt to?
It was back to the manifest destiny. And it was the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1846.
Okay. Okay. Some things never change.
History repeats itself and the planets prove it, okay?
That's right. The cyclic nature of planets. And I guess that's, what we as individuals, when we have these new cycles or a Saturn return, we grow and we learn and we say, oh, okay, well, I know what happened the last time, that this happened in my chart, and I will not do that again. And hopefully if, nations grow more of a conscience and they stop burning books, then they too will learn from, their mistakes and from history. And that's, I think, the higher message of what's going on right now. And because they haven't learned, in fact, there's been this pushback from Fox News and other organizations, again, back to Pluto in the third house of propaganda, that number one, a really poor educational system. You know, when millions of people vote for Trump, it's like, what were they thinking? You know, and of course, then his active agenda is to fight the woke people, and that is education, which is why he's, attacking the universities, the educational systems, and so forth, because those are the people who think, who come up with their own conclusions. And this, it's always a personal thing with Trump. And those are the people who wanted to put him in jail.
Well, he's also going after the museums and libraries too. Any exposure.
Anything that's woke, books, and you read them books, and then you get these ideas in your head.
Well, there's another level of that if you hear from the other side of what he's really addressing and claiming that most of these higher educational institutions are promoting Marxist propaganda. And that's another deep dive.
Yes,
What
yes.
I think Fredette was mentioning earlier about who's really running the show, then you have to go into secret societies, because we will not know from just exploring on a surface level. So that's a whole other ball of wax. But
Yeah,
I
it
think
really is. Yeah,
other than his wokeness, there is something about that also.
true, true. And that was, one of the things from the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist takeover of Russia, and then the expansion that really frightened the West. And then they were, anything socialist, communist, we don't want to go in that direction. Forgetting the fact that, there's actually some good ideas from the socialist things. And if you take a look at, let's say, like the Scandinavian countries, they're social democrats, and they've got it a lot better than Americans, I'll tell you. Even you think about, medical care and people who don't
Right.
really worry about stuff, education and retirement. The Scandinavian countries are not worried about that because the system is taking care of them.
Sweden is known as the best country to live in on every agenda in the world.
That's right, right. And Finland's up there too,
I'm
and
sorry.
Denmark. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, maybe we'll learn from them, hopefully.
I think if we pay attention to Bernie Sanders, he's all for that. He's been
Yeah, I
telling
know
us,
he is.
he's been consistent for decades. He's really has got some really good ideas, and some of that is, imported from the Scandinavian lands, or wherever that they're doing it right, and the people, because he's very much about the people, the common workers, that they get a fair shake.
Is he a Virgo?
I think he's a Virgo, isn't he?
I think so. He's out there working anyway.
He's out there working. And he's amazing. He's what, 83?
I know.
Yeah,
I
he
like
is,
listening to him.
he
I
is
just do.
vital and strong and doing these really great gatherings here with AOC in Republican states, and that's, I think, an interesting counterbalance to what's going on. True, true. Well, that AI coming in is pretty interesting. I think that's also a factor of Saturn and Neptune in Pisces the last couple of years. It really has opened up, and Pisces is like the make-believe, right? And Neptune is the ruler of Pisces. So images, pictures, songs, and then Saturn makes it manifest. It says, let's do this. Let's make it happen. Let's set up the technology so that we can gather up all this information. But yeah, so that's a big thing, the AI in the last couple of years, and that's going to make the propaganda folks, they're already using that. When you can take like somebody's face and image, and put words in their mouth as if they say it.
Yeah.
They've been doing that, for several years now. So what's true anymore? But that's back to, I think, the Pluto in the third house in the US chart. This is the propaganda, this is the information that we're getting, and but it can be manipulated, and then Pluto is there and saying, and what's the truth? What's really going on?
Mhm. What's
Yeah.
the agenda behind the information? That's what I always look at. What lies
Right.
for? What
Yeah.
reaction are you trying to get from me? I can give you a response, but I'm not going to give you a reaction until I check it out. It's that
Exactly.
simple.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that meme that was going around even during the COVID time, a picture of Abraham Lincoln, and with the quote that says, "One should not trust everything that you see on the internet."
But, it's just the way it is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to bring this recording to an end, but we can, if you wish, you can.